It is the 15th of August, 1805. The city of Rome lies below, vast and ancient and indifferent. Three men have climbed to the top of Monte Sacro, a hill on the eastern edge of the city, unremarkable now, though it carries a long memory. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the poor of Rome climbed this same hill to protest the rule of the wealthy. They withdrew their labor. They threatened to build their own city. They forced the powerful to negotiate. The three men standing here now know that history. One of them made sure they would. His name is Simón Rodriguez. He is a tutor, a philosopher, a wanderer in the tradition of Rousseau. The second man is Fernando del Toro, a Venezuelan nobleman and old friend. The third is the one who matters most to this story. He is 21 years old, Venezuelan by birth, recently widowed, restless in the way that grief sometimes makes a person restless. His name is Simón Bolívar. Standing on that hilltop, Bolívar kneels. He takes the hands of his two companions. He speaks, and what he says, more or less, is this: that he will not rest until he has broken the chains that bind the peoples of South America to the Spanish crown. It is the kind of vow that young men sometimes make. History is full of vows made on hilltops, most of them forgotten. What makes this one different is that Bolívar kept it, at a cost that neither he nor anyone around him could have imagined on that August afternoon, with the Roman countryside spread beneath them and the city cooling in the late summer heat. He would spend the next 25 years of his life fighting, organizing, retreating, crossing mountains, losing battles, winning campaigns, executing former allies, surviving assassination attempts, watching republics crumble, and building them again. He would liberate 6 nations from colonial rule. He would die at 47, sick, exhausted, and widely despised in the country he had given his life to free. This is his story. To understand Simón Bolívar, it helps to understand what Venezuela was in the year of his birth. It was the 24th of July, 1783. The city of Caracas was the capital of the Captaincy General of Venezuela, a Spanish imperial colony perched on the northern edge of South America. The colony had existed for over 2 centuries, its wealth built on the labor of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples working in mines, on plantations, and in the households of the colonial elite. At the top of this society sat a small group of families known as Creoles, Spanish by descent, born in the Americas, wealthy enough to own land and command the labor of others. They occupied an uncomfortable middle position in the imperial order. They were not Spanish-born, which meant they were not fully trusted by Madrid, but they were not indigenous or African, which meant they controlled the local economy. They were colonists who had become, in their own minds at least, something else, something not quite Spanish, not quite independent, and deeply uncertain about what they were entitled to. The Bolívars were one of the oldest and most powerful of these families. Their fortune traced back to Simón de Bolívar, a Basque settler who arrived in the Americas in the 1560s, helped to establish the colony of Venezuela, and, as accountant general, used his position to ensure that his descendants would become the wealthiest landowners in the region. By the time of the future liberator's birth, the family owned 12 houses, a copper mine, a rum distillery, a textile business, and extensive agricultural estates. All of it was worked by hundreds of enslaved people. His father, Colonel Don Juan Vicente de Bolívar, was 57 years old when his 4th child was born. His mother, Doña María de la Concepción Palacios y Blanco, was 23. She had been 14 when she married, 32 years her husband's junior. The marriage was not unusual for its time or class. The Palacios family was equally distinguished, their roots in the Americas stretching back further than the Bolívars, descended from German banking dynasties who in 1528 had received a royal grant from Charles V to extract wealth from the continent. Into this world of privilege, deep inequality, and impending political tension, Simón Bolívar was born. His birth was celebrated by gatherings of Caracas's oldest families. His father named him after an illustrious ancestor by pointing to a portrait on the wall. But the world those families inhabited was beginning to shift. Throughout the 1770s, the Bourbon monarchy in Madrid had introduced a series of reforms designed to tighten Spain's control over its colonial revenues. In 1777, the Captaincy General of Venezuela was formally established, bringing with it higher taxes and greater restrictions on local commerce. For 2 centuries, Creole families had held significant political positions in their own territories. Under the new arrangement, Madrid appointed Spanish-born officials in their place. To the Creoles, these replacements were not simply inconvenient. They were a humiliation. Men of lesser merit, chosen for loyalty rather than competence. The grievance was familiar. A decade earlier, something very similar had motivated the colonists of British North America to raise arms against their own imperial masters. By the year of Bolivar's birth, the United States of America had won its independence. The example was not lost on the men of Caracas. Bolivar's own father, Don Juan Vicente, had in 1782 written to a Venezuelan colonel and revolutionary adventurer named Francisco de Miranda, asking for advice on how to organize a possible insurrection against the crown. The plans came to nothing. Don Juan Vicente died of tuberculosis in January 1786 before any conspiracy could take shape. He left behind a fortune, 4 children, and a 27-year-old widow. The childhood that followed was turbulent in the particular way that wealthy but unlucky childhoods can be. Bolivar had been raised in his early years largely by a black wet nurse named Hippolyta, who adored him but found him ungovernable. His father's death when he was 2 years old left the family's affairs in the hands of his mother, who recognized early that Simón was the most difficult of her children. She appointed a distinguished lawyer, José Miguel Sanz, as the boy's guardian and administrator of his inheritance. Sanz was known for his severity. It made no difference. When Bolivar was 8, his mother's health was failing rapidly. She died on the 6th of July, 1792, of the same tuberculosis that had taken her husband 6 years before. Simón was not yet 9 years old. He was now an orphan. He and his siblings passed first into the care of their maternal grandfather, Don Feliciano Palacios, who died the following year. Then into the care of maternal uncles, who proved both neglectful and financially irresponsible, gradually squandering the fortune the children had inherited. Bolivar responded by escaping. He spent time on the streets of Caracas, befriending children far below his own social station. Children who were black, mixed race, poor. Whatever education and discipline his guardians were attempting to impose, the unruly 12-year-old was constructing his own alternative curriculum in the back streets of the colonial capital. In June 1795, while his uncle Carlos was away, Bolivar ran to the house of his married sister and refused to return. A custody dispute followed, dragging through the courts. Eventually, through a new arrangement, he came under the instruction of a man who would shape him more profoundly than anyone before or since. His name was Simón Rodríguez. Rodríguez was 25 when he became Bolivar's personal tutor. He was an admirer of Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Rousseau, and believed that education should be something lived and experienced, not merely absorbed from books. He taught his student outdoors, on horseback, in the open air. He encouraged independent thought. He treated the boy's restless intelligence not as a problem to be managed, but as a quality to be directed. Bolivar would later say that Rodríguez was the most formative influence of his life. But the arrangement was short-lived. In 1797, Rodríguez was implicated in a conspiracy against the Spanish authorities. He escaped punishment, but was forced into exile. He would not see his former pupil again for nearly a decade. Deprived of his tutor, and as a condition of his inheritance, Bolivar enrolled in the White Volunteers of the Valley of Aragua, a militia founded by his grandfather and commanded by his father. He spent a year learning the basics of military service and was promoted to second lieutenant. At 15, his uncle Esteban arranged for him to complete his education in Spain. On the 19th of January 1799, he sailed from Venezuela aboard the San Ildefonso. He would not return for more than 3 years. When he did, everything would be different. The voyage to Spain was perilous. A British naval blockade diverted the ship from its intended port of Cadiz, and a violent storm extended what should have been a straightforward crossing into a journey of more than 4 months. Madrid, when Bolivar finally arrived, was a revelation, though not entirely a flattering one. His uncle Esteban arranged for him to be taken under the wing of the Marquis of Ustariz, a native of Caracas who sat on the Spanish Supreme Council of War. The Marquis provided structure, languages, mathematics, history, fencing, dancing. Bolivar was introduced to the life of the Spanish court and did not always like what he found there. King Carlos IV was passive and easily manipulated. Political power had spent the 1790s in the hands of the Prime Minister Manuel Godoy, who was also, by most accounts, the Queen's lover. Godoy's unpopularity eventually forced him from office, whereupon the Queen took up with a new favorite, a man named Manuel Malo, who happened to be the close friend and roommate of Bolivar's uncle Esteban. The connection gave the young Venezuelan a view behind the curtain of imperial governance. What he saw was not impressive. The Spanish monarchy, for all its wealth and ceremony, rested on weak foundations. The court was corrupt. The politics were petty. The empire that ruled his homeland was administered by men who appeared to have little idea of what they were doing and even less concern for the consequences. It was in Madrid, too, that Bolívar fell in love. Her name was María Teresa Rodríguez del Toro. She was 19, the daughter of wealthy Venezuelan parents born in Spain. Her father was hesitant about the match. Bolívar was young, impulsive, and clearly in a hurry. But the courtship succeeded, and on the 26th of May 1802, the two were married. 3 weeks later, they sailed together for Venezuela aboard the same San Ildefonso that had carried Bolívar across the Atlantic 3 years before. For María Teresa, it was her first glimpse of the colonial world her parents had come from. For Bolívar, it was a homecoming. They had been in Caracas less than 8 months when María Teresa contracted yellow fever. She died on the 22nd of January 1803, at the age of 21. The grief that followed was genuine and lasting. Bolívar would later describe his wife's death as the event that turned him from a man of private ambitions toward a life of larger purpose. He vowed never to remarry. It was a promise he kept. He returned to Europe at the end of 1803, spending time in Madrid before crossing the Pyrenees into France with Fernando del Toro, María Teresa's cousin, and one of his closest friends. In May 1804, they arrived in Paris. Napoleon Bonaparte was then at the height of his early power. He had seized control of France in 1799, ending nearly a decade of political instability with a military coup, and in the years since had reorganized the French state, reformed its legal system, and presented himself, convincingly to many observers, as the embodiment of Enlightenment meritocracy, a man who had risen not through birth but through ability. Bolívar was deeply impressed. When Napoleon was proclaimed emperor on the 18th of May 1804, Bolívar's admiration dimmed somewhat. When the coronation ceremony took place at Notre Dame on the 2nd of December, with Napoleon placing the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope, Bolívar's feelings became more complicated. A general who had overthrown a corrupt government in the name of liberty and then made himself a hereditary monarch was not quite the example he had been looking for, but the underlying template remained. A military commander, operating in a moment of political chaos, could seize power and reshape a nation according to rational principles. The idea lodged itself. In Paris, Bolívar also encountered Alexander von Humboldt, the German scientist who had recently returned from years of travel through Latin America and knew Venezuela well. The conversations between the young Venezuelan and the world-renowned naturalist ranged across geography, politics, and the future of the Americas. It was also in Paris that he was reunited with Simón Rodríguez. By April 1805, the three men, Bolívar, Del Toro, and Rodríguez, set out for Italy together. They were in Milan when Napoleon was crowned King of Italy. They continued to Rome. And it was there, on the 15th of August, that they climbed Monte Sacro. The vow Bolívar made that afternoon was not made in isolation. It was the product of everything he had absorbed over the previous years: the decay of the Spanish court, the power of the French example, the conversations with Humboldt, the re-encounter with the teacher who had first taught him to think freely. His personal grief had become political conviction. The young widower from Caracas had decided what his life was for. He would spend the next 22 years trying to make good on that decision. Bolívar returned to Caracas in June 1807. He gathered around him a circle of friends and family members, men of his own class, Creoles who shared his dissatisfaction with the Spanish colonial order. They talked about revolution. They had no real plans for one. The opportunity came not from within Venezuela, but from thousands of miles away. In the autumn of 1807, Napoleon invaded Portugal. His army passed through Spain with the permission of the Spanish government, but the force he sent, numbering 100,000 soldiers, was far larger than anyone had agreed to, and it left Spain in a state of effective occupation. In March 1808, a popular uprising forced the pro-French Prime Minister Godoy from office and compelled King Carlos IV to abdicate in favor of his son Ferdinand. Father and son then appealed to Napoleon himself to arbitrate the succession. Napoleon's response was to summon both men to the French city of Bayonne and force them both to abdicate. On the 7th of May 1808, he installed his elder brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The reaction in Spain was immediate and furious. A popular uprising began in Madrid. A junta in Seville declared loyalty to the imprisoned Ferdinand VII and took on the role of legitimate Spanish government. Britain, already at war with France, sent armies to support the resistance, beginning a 6-year conflict known as the Peninsular War. When news reached Venezuela in July 1808, the Caracas City Council moved carefully. They established their own governing body and declared loyalty to Ferdinand, not to the French-backed regime in Madrid. Other colonies followed: Buenos Aires, Bogotá, Quito, Mexico City. Each established its own junta. Each claimed to be governing in the name of the king. None were prepared quite yet to say the word independence out loud. Bolívar found the situation frustrating. He despised Ferdinand from his time in Madrid and had no interest in professing loyalty, even for tactical reasons. But when the opportunity came to be of use, he took it. On the 19th of April 1810, the Creoles of Caracas staged a coup against the newly appointed Captain General and established the Supreme Junta of Caracas. They still declared loyalty to Ferdinand. Bolívar volunteered to serve as an envoy to the British government in London, a mission the junta accepted, appointing him colonel and sending him west. The diplomatic mission was not a success in conventional terms. Bolívar arrived in London, met with Foreign Secretary Lord Richard Wellesley, and proceeded with characteristic impatience to inform the British minister that Venezuela intended to pursue full independence, inadvertently handing him his written instructions from the junta, which said the exact opposite. Wellesley, bound by Britain's alliance with Spain, could not formally support the Venezuelan cause, but he was moved by what he heard and left the door open for further discussions. The more consequential meeting happened in Bolívar's own time. In direct defiance of the junta's instructions, the Venezuelan envoys sought out Francisco de Miranda. The old revolutionary had been in London for years. He and Bolívar had long conversations, not just about the cause of independence, but about the practicalities of governing a liberated territory. Economics, administration, law. What would a free Venezuela actually look like? Bolívar returned to Caracas on the 5th of December 1810, with Miranda arriving 5 days later. The republic that followed was imperfect and contested from its first days. The Creole-dominated government could not hold the loyalty of Venezuela's non-white majority. Enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, mixed-race Venezuelans who had little reason to prefer Creole masters to Spanish ones. Royalist sympathizers exploited these divisions effectively. On the 5th of July 1811, Congress voted for full independence. Venezuela became the first Spanish-American colony to do so. It lasted barely a year. The early months of the Venezuelan Republic were marked by instability that no decree could paper over. In July 1811, an uprising occurred in the city of Valencia among sectors of the population that wanted no part of Creole self-rule. The government force sent to suppress it performed poorly. Miranda was eventually given command. He went, but only after ensuring that Bolívar would not be assigned to his staff. The snub infuriated Bolívar. He was given a position under the Marquis del Toro instead, but in the battles that followed, he distinguished himself. Valencia was retaken, and Bolívar's competence under fire was noted. Then, on the 26th of March 1812, a series of powerful earthquakes struck northern Venezuela. Caracas was devastated. Thousands died. The destruction fell heavily on Republican-held areas. The churches interpreted it as divine punishment for defiance of the crown. Large portions of the population agreed. In this desperate moment, Congress appointed Miranda as dictator. He fought a cautious campaign against the royalist commander Domingo de Monteverde, avoiding pitched battles and making no decisive moves. Bolívar was assigned to defend the port of Puerto Cabello, a significant position, as its fort held both Spanish prisoners and a large arsenal. On the 30th of June, the fort's second-in-command released the prisoners and declared for Ferdinand VII. Bolívar begged Miranda for reinforcements. None came. The port fell. What happened next divided the two men for good. Bolívar returned to Caracas to find that Miranda was already in the process of surrendering to Monteverde. Whether Miranda believed the fight was lost, or whether the Regency's new liberal constitution gave him reason to think Spanish rule might be tolerable after all, is a question historians have debated ever since. What is clear is that Bolívar was appalled. He learned that Miranda intended to escape to England from the port of La Guaira. Together with the port's governor, Bolívar arranged to have him arrested. Miranda was handed over to Spanish authorities. He spent the rest of his life in Spanish prisons and died in 1816, never having seen Venezuela again. There are those who have never forgiven Bolívar for this. His defenders argue that Miranda's surrender was a betrayal of everything the Republic stood for, and that arresting him was an act of necessary justice. His critics argue that whatever Miranda's failures, delivering him to the Spanish was an act of cold cruelty that exposed the limits of Bolívar's loyalty to his own allies. In any case, Bolívar himself had to flee. Using connections from his royalist past, he obtained a passport and escaped to the British-controlled island of Curaçao. From there, he made his way to the port of Cartagena in New Granada. He was 29 years old, stateless, without an army, and carrying a reputation that was somewhere between distinguished and damaged. He began again. In Cartagena, Bolívar did what he would do throughout his career when confronted with disaster. He sat down and wrote. The document he produced, known as the Cartagena Manifesto, was a diagnosis and a call to arms. It argued that the Venezuelan Republic had failed not because independence was a wrong idea, but because it had been pursued weakly. The government had been too lenient, too divided, too unwilling to take the measures that survival required. If Spanish rule was to be overthrown, the whole of South America had to act as a single body. He was assigned to the remote outpost of Barranca on the Magdalena River. He accepted the posting, won the support of the local landowners, recruited what men he could, and began attacking Spanish positions along the river. Within 15 days, between the 21st of December 1812 and the 8th of January 1813, his force had taken control of the full 300-mile length of the river. It was a small campaign in the scheme of things, but it was startling for what it demonstrated: Bolívar's ability to move fast, to inspire men who had no particular reason to follow him, to translate political conviction into military momentum. More success followed. In late February 1813, his combined force attacked a Spanish army twice their size at the border town of Cúcuta and won. He was promoted to brigadier general. He was then granted permission to invade Venezuela, despite having only 500 men under his command, after his rival Colonel Manuel del Castillo quit the army in a fit of professional jealousy. Bolívar's response to being abandoned by his second-in-command on the eve of an invasion of a heavily defended territory was to invade anyway. He captured the city of Mérida on the 23rd of May, where he was proclaimed liberator for the first time. By the 14th of June, he had taken the province of Trujillo. And there, conscious that holding territory was harder than taking it, he issued what became known as the Decree of War to the Death. The text was direct and uncompromising. Spaniards and those from the Canary Islands, who did not actively support the Republican cause, could expect death. Americans, by which he meant those of any race born in the colonies, could expect mercy, even if they had fought against him. It was not a declaration of policy so much as a statement of urgency. The time for half measures had passed. The decree had immediate tactical effects. Hundreds of royalist soldiers defected rather than face its terms. It also set in motion a logic of violence that Bolívar could not easily control, and the conflict would grow bloodier in ways that outlasted any strategic benefit. Bolívar pressed on. In defiance of his orders not to march on Caracas, he drove his 1,000-odd soldiers through 5 engagements in 10 days against forces vastly outnumbering them. On the 6th of August, 1813, he entered Caracas, accepted its surrender, and proclaimed a new republic. He had been away from his birthplace for 3 years. He returned as its liberator and its dictator. The Second Venezuelan Republic survived for barely a year, and its collapse was more violent than the first. The fundamental problem had not changed. The Creole Republic commanded the loyalty of the Creole class. It had far less hold over the mixed race and black population of Venezuela, many of whom looked at the conflict and saw not liberation but one group of masters replacing another. The man who exploited this most effectively was not a Spanish general. He was a Venezuelan of obscure origin named José Tomás Boves, who commanded a cavalry force drawn largely from the plains, men called llaneros, skilled horsemen and hunters who had no love for the colonial elite on either side. Boves's men fought for the Spanish crown, at least in name, but they answered primarily to Boves himself. His army, known by some as the Legions of Hell, was a force of social revolution as much as military resistance. Bolívar fought Boves in a series of increasingly savage engagements. The war became, in Bolívar's own words, a race war, a conflict not just between Republicans and Royalists, but between the classes and races that Venezuela's colonial history had set against each other. Atrocities were committed on all sides. In February 1814, after loyalists imprisoned in La Guaira were found to be planning an uprising, Bolívar ordered their execution. More than 1,000 Spanish prisoners were killed over the course of 4 days. The order was not a moment of passion, but a calculated decision by a man who had come to believe that survival required it. Whether it was justified is a question that has no clean answer. What is clear is that it did not save the Republic. Boves continued to advance. By July 1814, Caracas was lost. The Royalists retook the city. Boves himself, having promised the non-white population of Venezuela a social order in which they were no longer at the bottom, moved with his men through the capital, overturning centuries of hierarchy and placing black and mixed-race Caracans in positions of authority. He was killed at the Battle of Urica on the 5th of December 1814, even as his army won. The Republic was finished. Bolívar retreated first to Barcelona, then to Cartagena. Then, when a massive Spanish expedition of 14,000 soldiers and more than 60 ships arrived under General Pablo Morillo to Jamaica. He had no army. He had no territory. He had barely a plan. From Jamaica, he wrote letters to Britain and to the United States, asking for support. He received polite interest and no material assistance. He then sailed to Haiti. The Republic of Haiti had been the first nation in the Americas to achieve independence through the rebellion of enslaved people. Its president, Alexandre Pétion, was a man who understood from first-hand experience what the liberation Bolívar spoke about might actually mean. Pétion agreed to provide Bolívar with ships, arms, personnel, and supplies. He asked for one thing in return, that when Bolívar returned to South America, he would abolish slavery. On the 2nd of May 1816, Bolívar landed on the island of Margarita, the only part of Venezuela that had remained under Republican control, defended by the tenacious Juan Bautista Arizmendi. Bolívar proclaimed a third republic, named himself its supreme chief, declared an end to the war to the death, and announced the abolition of slavery. These were significant declarations. The abolition of slavery, in particular, was not something previous Venezuelan Republican governments had been willing to commit to. Bolívar understood that the social hierarchy Boves had turned against him could only be neutralized, not reversed, not immediately undone, but made less lethal, if the Republic offered something real to people who had every reason to distrust it. Whether the Republic had the strength to deliver on these promises was another matter. The initial campaign faltered badly. The arms Bolívar had received from Haiti were captured by the Spanish at Ocumare. When he sailed east to reunite with General Mariño, the latter turned against him, and Bolívar escaped to Haiti once more. He returned to Venezuela in January 1817, this time landing at Barcelona. Mariño, along with other leaders who had recently abandoned him, greeted him again with apparent loyalty. The pattern was becoming familiar. The Republicans hatched a new plan: march into the interior of Venezuela to link up with General Manuel Piar and seek the support of José Antonio Páez, a former royalist who now led an army that included many veterans of Boves's cavalry. Bolívar would avoid direct confrontation with Morillo, while his fleet, under Admiral Luis Brion, blockaded the coast. Piar had already been fighting successfully in the province of Guayana and was not inclined to share the credit. The relationship between the two men deteriorated rapidly. Piar began working to undermine Bolívar's authority, appealing to racial divisions within the army. Bolívar had Piar arrested and tried. He was executed by firing squad. In later years, Bolívar would describe it as one of the most painful decisions of his career and one of the most necessary. Whether other warlords took the lesson he intended is uncertain. What is clear is that Bolívar's willingness to execute an effective and popular general demonstrated that his authority was not merely rhetorical. Mariño, watching events unfold, chose a third time to align himself with Bolívar. By early 1819, the military situation had reached something resembling a stalemate. Bolívar controlled much of the interior of Venezuela, particularly the province of Guayana and the surrounding plains. Morillo held the coast, the cities, and the strategic ports. Neither side had the strength to finish the other. In February 1819, Bolívar opened the Congress of Angostura, an effort to give his republic proper political institutions and a constitution rather than remaining a military dictatorship in revolutionary clothes. He gave a speech laying out his vision for a republic built on stability and liberty, not one modeled on the United States, which he admired but believed unsuitable for South American realities. and not one modeled on France, but something adapted to the continent's specific history and social complexity. He was elected president by the Congress. The following day, he returned to his main preoccupation, the army. He had been purchasing arms and ammunition from New York and London. From Britain, he received something more valuable, a steady stream of officers recently discharged after the Napoleonic Wars, professional soldiers with experience of modern warfare. Over the next 5 years, more than 5,000 British and Irish volunteers would serve in the armies of South American liberation. Páez, meanwhile, had been fighting a brilliant guerrilla campaign against Murillo, never committing to large engagements, but maintaining constant pressure and winning a significant victory at the Battle of Mucuritas in early 1817. When Bolívar arrived on the plains and the two men finally met in January 1818, the chemistry was immediate. Páez's style of warfare was a revelation. Bolívar had come to the banks of the Apure River unsure how to cross it without exposing his army to the enemy on the far bank. He watched as Páez sent 50 horsemen straight across the river, in broad daylight, under Spanish fire, to capture the sentries and seize 4 Spanish gunboats. They ferried Bolívar's entire army to the other side. In February 1818, Bolívar surprised Murillo at Calabozo and captured his supplies. Murillo escaped during the night. The chase that followed was unsuccessful, and in March, Bolívar suffered a significant defeat, losing more than 1,000 men. He regrouped, he governed, he waited. By the time June 1819 arrived, he had developed a plan of startling ambition. The Venezuelan plains were flooding with the rainy season. Staying meant starvation, disease, and slow attrition. Murillo controlled the cities. But New Granada, the neighboring territory to the west, the one that Bolívar had organized and campaigned through years before, was not yet fully secured by the Spanish, and the mountain passes that connected the two territories were, in the coldest and most difficult months of year, left largely undefended. The Spanish did not believe anyone would attempt to cross them. Bolívar proposed to cross them. His army set out on the 4th of June and arrived at the foot of the Andes at the beginning of July. Over the next 5 days, they crossed the Páramo de Pisba, a high-altitude pass where the temperature drops to near freezing and the air is thin enough to sicken even seasoned soldiers. Hundreds of men died. Horses could not survive at that altitude. Many soldiers arrived on the other side without shoes. But they arrived. The Granadan population welcomed them with food, rest, and fresh recruits. The Spanish, who had assumed the pass impassable, had nothing to meet them. On the 25th of July, Bolívar's army met the Spanish at the Battle of Pantano de Vargas. The Royalists held the higher ground and had the advantage for most of the engagement. The tide turned when Colonel Juan José Rondón led 14 horsemen in a charge directly into the enemy formation. The Spanish lines broke. Rondón's cavalry played the same decisive role again at the Battle of Boyacá on the 7th of August, a battle that, in Murillo's own assessment, undid 5 years of Spanish effort in a single afternoon. 3 days later, Bolívar entered Bogotá. The Spanish officials had already gone. Bolívar spent the final months of 1819 in a state of intense political activity. He set up the essential institutions of government in Bogotá, appointing his vice president Francisco de Paula Santander, a trained lawyer and administrator, to manage the day-to-day affairs of the state. He then spent 2 months traveling across New Granada, consolidating support and recruiting for the campaigns that remained. On the 11th of December, he returned to the Venezuelan capital of Angostura. He addressed the Congress there. 3 days later, on the 14th of December, he proposed the formal union of Venezuela and New Granada as a single republic, which he named Greater Colombia. Congress agreed on the 17th. The vision had been there from the beginning, in his Cartagena Manifesto, in the oath on Monte Sacro, in his conversations with Miranda in London. Latin America united, governed as one. Greater Colombia was a start. Meanwhile, events in Spain had been developing in a direction that Bolívar could not have engineered, but could not have planned better himself. King Ferdinand VII, restored to his throne after the Napoleonic Wars, had been assembling a fresh expedition to reconquer the colonies. In January 1820, the troops designated for the expedition mutinied at Cadiz. They called for the restoration of the liberal constitution of 1812 that Ferdinand had revoked. The king, faced with the threat of civil war at home, had no choice but to comply. The expedition never sailed. Murillo's position in Venezuela became increasingly precarious. His men were exhausted, his supplies irregular, and his hope of reinforcement gone. In November 1820, he agreed to a 6-month armistice. On the 27th, Bolívar and Murillo met in person at the village of Santa Ana, two men who had spent years trying to destroy each other, shaking hands and speaking of peace. The armistice held until April 1821, when fighting resumed. But the balance had shifted decisively. The Royalists were demoralized. The Republicans were gaining in confidence by the month. On the 24th of June 1821, at the Battle of Carabobo, Bolívar's 6,500 men met the Spanish under General Miguel de la Torre. Paez's cavalry and the British Volunteer Legion broke the Royalist formation. What remained of the Spanish army fled. On the 29th of June 1821, Simón Bolívar rode through the streets of his native Caracas. He had left his birthplace as a young widower with an impulsive vow and a vague ambition. He returned as the president of a new republic and the liberator of his homeland. He was 37 years old. The war was not over. Not for Bolívar. Colombia was free. Venezuela was free. But Quito, modern Ecuador, and Peru remained under Spanish rule. So did Upper Peru. And as long as any part of the continent remained a colony, the work he had promised himself on that Roman hilltop was unfinished. He sent his young protégé, General Antonio José de Sucre, south to the port city of Guayaquil. Sucre was 27 years old, methodical, loyal, and enormously capable. Bolívar's efforts to reach him and push further south in early 1822 met fierce resistance, but a costly battle at Bomboná on the 7th of April distracted the Spanish enough for Sucre to maneuver south. On the 24th of May 1822, Sucre's men descended from the slopes of the Pichincha volcano above Quito and defeated the Spanish army that had come to meet them. The city fell the following day. The last Royalist stronghold in the region, Pasto, surrendered to Bolívar's men soon after. On the 16th of June, the liberator entered Quito. The whole of Greater Colombia was now under his command. 3 days later, the United States granted diplomatic recognition to the Republic, the formal acknowledgement Bolívar had been seeking for 4 years. In Quito, Bolívar met Manuela Sáenz, a 25-year-old revolutionary activist, married to an English merchant, deeply committed to the cause of South American independence. The two became lovers and would remain so for the rest of Bolívar's life. Sáenz was not merely a companion. She served as a secretary and as an intelligence officer. She had courage that would, on at least one occasion, save his life. The question of Peru now dominated everything. The Argentine general José de San Martín had been fighting in Peru for more than a year and had captured Lima in July 1821. But most of Peru remained under Spanish control, and San Martín's political position in Lima was tenuous. When he sailed into Guayaquil in July 1822, hoping to press his territorial claims, he found Bolívar there before him. Their meeting, private, brief, never fully documented, was the encounter of the two great liberators of South America. They agreed on almost nothing. San Martín wanted a monarchy for Peru and was looking for a European prince. Bolívar found the idea deeply objectionable. San Martín expected substantial Colombian military reinforcements. Bolívar offered a few hundred soldiers. During one of their conversations, Bolívar informed San Martín that the deputy he had left in charge in Lima had been overthrown in a coup. San Martín's position at home had collapsed while he argued about borders. He chose to leave. Within months of his departure, the Spanish had retaken Lima. The Peruvian Republic was in chaos. Successive governments begged Bolívar for help. He arrived in Lima on the 1st of September 1823, accepted the post of Supreme Commander, and immediately encountered the depth of the disorder he had taken on. The Chilean and Argentine soldiers who had fought under San Martín were withdrawing. The Peruvian elites were ungovernable. In February 1824, President Torre Tegel defected to the Royalists, bringing Lima back under Spanish control and taking 350 officers with him. Bolívar, ill but recovering, read the news from a sickbed in the interior and began to plan. He had been here before. The city was gone. The countryside remained. He established his headquarters in Trujillo, gathered men and supplies, and prepared a new campaign. Manuela Sáenz, exhausted by her frequent separations from him, offered to join his staff as a secretary. She also drilled with the cavalry. Bolívar accepted both offers. On the afternoon of the 6th of August 1824, at the Battle of Junín, Bolivar's army met the Spanish under General José de Canterac on the high plains above Cusco. The battle was brief and fierce, and decided entirely by cavalry. The Colombians were faster and more disciplined. The Spanish broke and fled, leaving their supplies behind. Lima was evacuated by the Royalists shortly after. The final battle was left to Sucre. On the 9th of December 1824, at Ayacucho, Sucre's 5,700 men faced a slightly larger Royalist force. The Royalists broke through the Patriot lines early in the engagement. What followed was a counterattack of such ferocity that Canterac agreed to unconditional surrender. The last organized Spanish army on the continent laid down its arms. South America was free. What happens after liberation is often a different kind of problem than liberation itself. Bolívar understood this. He had been thinking about governance for as long as he had been thinking about warfare, and the two problems were not entirely separate in his mind. He had always believed that South America's newly independent nations would need strong central authority to survive, not because he had contempt for liberty, but because he had watched repeatedly what happened when authority was absent. The first Venezuelan republic had collapsed. The second had collapsed. Warlords had gone to war against each other, against the Spanish, and against their own allies. Race and class had been weaponized by all parties. His constitution for the new Republic of Bolivia, which he drafted in 1826, tried to square this circle. It guaranteed freedom of speech, equality before the law, the abolition of slavery, and all social privilege. It also created a presidency for life, reasoning that the only alternative was the chaos he had witnessed across 2 decades. The Colombians read the lifetime presidency and saw the threat of tyranny. The Venezuelans, accustomed to Bolívar's personal authority, were more comfortable with it. The contradiction at the heart of his politics, between the liberty he had fought for and the authority he believed was necessary to preserve it, was not going to resolve itself by good intentions. The Congress of Panama, which opened in June 1826, and which Bolívar had hoped would lay the foundations for a united Latin America, dissolved without meaningful agreement. The shared interest in independence was not enough, it turned out, to overcome the particular interests of each emerging nation. Páez, meanwhile, had grown impatient with Bogotà's attempts to assert authority over Venezuela and declared independence from the Colombian Federation. Bolívar's vice president Santander, who had been running Colombian affairs from Bogotá with considerable effectiveness, was moving toward a political philosophy that differed sharply from Bolívar's, favoring the rule of law and constitutional limits over personal power. The two men would spend the final years of Bolívar's life in deepening conflict. There were assassination attempts. The most serious came on the night of the 25th of September 1828, when a group of conspirators entered the presidential palace in Bogotá. Manuela Sáenz helped Bolívar escape through a window, then deliberately misdirected the conspirators and endured a beating for her efforts. Bolívar hid under a bridge for 3 hours before it was safe to return. He survived. His health did not improve. The man who had liberated half a continent was now denounced as a tyrant, not by the Spanish, but by the people he had liberated. The accusations were not entirely without basis. He had ordered executions, he had assumed dictatorial powers, he had dissolved assemblies, he had done these things, he believed, because the alternative was collapse. Others believed the alternative was freedom. The racial hierarchy that had underpinned colonial society had not been dismantled. Slavery had been abolished in principle. In practice, the Creole elite remained at the top of most of the societies Bolívar had liberated, and the promised equality remained distant for the majority of people. The wars of liberation had halved populations in some regions and left economies in ruin. The debts incurred in fighting Spain would burden the new nations for generations. By 1830, Greater Colombia was coming apart. Bolívar announced his resignation from the presidency at the Constitutional Congress that met in January of that year. It was not immediately accepted. On the 27th of April, it was. He prepared to go into exile in Europe. There was a practical problem. He had refused to accept a salary throughout his career. He had given away most of his monetary rewards. The vast estates that had made his family one of the wealthiest in Venezuela had been ruined by a decade of war. His old comrades in Caracas stripped him of citizenship and his remaining property. The new Venezuelan constitution set a minimum age of 40 for the presidency, a provision that effectively barred Sucre, his preferred successor, from office. He left Bogotá on the 8th of May, while he waited for a ship to take him across the Atlantic. News arrived that Sucre, the man Bolívar considered his most capable and most loyal subordinate, the general who had won Ayacucho, the leader he had trusted above all others, had been assassinated on the 4th of June while traveling from Bogotá to Quito. He was 35 years old. The details of who ordered the killing remain disputed. Bolívar received the news and was further diminished by it. By October, he could barely leave his bed. His lungs, compromised over years of campaigning in wet and cold and altitude, were failing. He was moved to the estate of a Spanish landowner near Santa Marta on the Caribbean coast. Several doctors attended him. On the 17th of December 1830, Simón Bolívar died of tuberculosis. He was 47 years old. In his final months, he had received messages from Bogotá urging him to return to power. He refused, not only because he was dying, but because he had acknowledged something he had never been willing to say aloud during the years of struggle, that the country he had created might be impossible to govern, at least as he had imagined governing it. He was right. The Republic of Greater Colombia was dissolved in November 1831, less than a year after his death. The territories he had liberated fractured into 6 independent nations: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, and Bolivia. The legacy of Simón Bolívar is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is has chosen a version. He was a man of genuine idealism who became capable of genuine cruelty. He believed in liberty and exercised autocratic power. He abolished slavery in principle and tolerated the persistence of racial inequality in practice. He fought for 2 decades to unite South America and watched it fragment around him. He was also, by any serious measure, a military genius. The campaign across the Andes in 1819 is studied in military academies to this day, not because it was a model of conventional planning, but because it succeeded precisely where conventional planning would have said it could not. The liberation of Venezuela, New Granada, Quito, and Peru constitutes one of the most sustained military and political campaigns in the history of the Americas. The contradictions in his legacy did not prevent future generations from using his name. They may, in fact, have made it easier to use, a figure complex enough to be claimed by almost any politics. President Páez of Venezuela, who helped to destroy Greater Colombia, was among the first. In 1842, he arranged for Bolívar's remains to be brought from Santa Marta to the cathedral in Caracas. 3 decades later, President Antonio Guzmán Blanco had the remains reinterred in the newly completed National Pantheon. In 1982, an army officer named Hugo Chávez founded the Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement, named for the liberator. After a failed coup attempt in 1992, Chávez was eventually elected president of Venezuela in 1998. The following year, he declared the Bolivarian Revolution and renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Chávez saw in Bolívar what he needed to see: the combination of popular appeal, anti-colonial purpose, and centralized power. Whether Bolívar himself would have recognized or approved of this interpretation is, at this point, unanswerable. He was a man of the early 19th century, shaped by Enlightenment ideas, colonial inheritance, and the particular chaos of a continent remaking itself in conditions of war. What he left behind is not a lesson, but a question. Whether the freedom he fought for required the power he accumulated. Whether the order he sought to impose was the cost of liberty or its negation. Whether the man who vowed on a Roman hilltop to free his people and spent the rest of his life doing it, died having kept his promise. He died in a borrowed room, on a borrowed estate, looking out toward a sea he never crossed again. The republic he built did not survive him by a year. The continent he dreamed of uniting spent the next 2 centuries divided, and 6 nations still carry, in their constitutions and their currencies and their public squares, the name of the man who made them possible.